That he was penniless. I was shocked. 16 years, a period of time that seemed long enough to bury all the pain. But today, the storm of the past has been brutally ripped open by a savage shock. Michael Jackson's personal doctor has finally broken his silence, revealing a terrifying truth about the death of the king of pop. A stark, chilling, and bitter confession. He has unraveled the hidden pieces of the puzzle details that have remained concealed for over a decade, leaving the entire world to shudder and wonder. Did Michael not only die from drugs, but also from a dark, unspoken secret? This is no longer a simple medical case. This is the collapse of a legend, the tragedy of a genius suffocated by the very darkness within his own life. Before we dive into this earth-shattering secret, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the truth that left the world breathless. Can you imagine that suffocating scene? A man of color who once walked like a deity on stage, whose every spin made the entire planet hold its breath. Yet in the very privacy of his own room in Holy Hills, he became a small, frail being, begging for sleep like a thirsty man in a desert. How painful that contradiction was. The world hailed Michael Jackson as the king of pop, but inside he was just a man tormented by endless sleepless nights, by the shadow of loneliness, and by pressures no one could ever imagine. People say that fame always comes with a shadow, and the night of June 25, 2009 was the night that shadow swallowed the entire legend. The so-called This Is It, Michael's comeback tour, was promoted as a revival. More than 50 shows in London, all tickets sold out in just a few hours. Fans everywhere cried with happiness, while some flew halfway around the world just to witness their idol. But even during rehearsals, those close to him saw a Michael who was gaunt, trembling, and anxious. The moonwalks were no longer as fluid as they once were. His singing was weak at times, and his eyes were often vacant, as if staring into an invisible void. It was said that just standing backstage, you could hear his exhausted gasps after each performance, as if that body had been pushed beyond its limits. But Michael didn't allow himself to stop. He told his friends that this was the only way to start over, to prove that he still had worth in the face of relentless criticism and the brutal scrutiny of the press and public. Dr. Conrad Murray entered Michael's life in that context. A doctor with a calm face, a polished demeanor, and most importantly, he made Michael believe he could give him the one thing he had craved for so many years, a genuine night's sleep. Among dozens of doctors who had treated Michael, Murray was chosen to be his companion, almost becoming a shadow in the final days of his life. It was said that Murray was not only a doctor, but also a confidant, witnessing every one of Michael's vulnerable moments. But it was that very trust that led Michael into tragedy. The night before that fateful morning, Michael Jackson entered his private bedroom, his eyes bloodshot from days of sleeplessness. He tried everything from lorazepam to midazolam, drugs that had become all too familiar in his daily life, but his body no longer responded. He sighed, his face revealing clear desperation. Time passed minute by minute like a frantic rhythm in his head. The next day's rehearsal did not allow him to show up in an exhausted state. He whispered to Murray in a choked voice that only the person by his side could hear, "Just give me the milk." Milk, the code name for the anesthetic Michael saw as the only remaining savior. In that moment, the contradiction reached its peak. On one side was medical protocol. Propofol should only be used in a hospital with full monitoring equipment and a medical team. On the other was Michael's burning desire to sleep just for a few hours so he could be on stage the next day. Murray hesitated, but the absolute trust of his patient made him give in. It was said that the bedroom, with its curtains drawn and dim yellow light, became a makeshift underground operating room. There were no monitor beeps, no standard oxygen tubes, just one doctor and a legend trembling on a bed. And then the needle touched Michael's vein, injecting the first dose of milk that night. But the terrifying thing was not the needle itself. The terrifying thing was the silence. While outside, Los Angeles was bustling with lights, every sound in that room gradually faded. Michael sank into a deep sleep, but it was not a peaceful one. It was a dependency, a path with no escape. and Murray, with all his subjectivity, believed he could control the situation. But he didn't realize that inside Michael's body, many other sedatives were quietly blending, creating a dangerous mixture, a cocktail that even veteran anesthesiologists would be wary of. No one could have known that in the very moment Michael felt he was being freed from the pain of insomnia, the tragedy had already begun. That night was not just a sleepless night for music. It was the night the entire world would later shudder to remember. A dark-skinned prince who once lit up stadiums was now just a person sleeping soundly in a dark room, carrying the ultimate contradiction of a lifetime. The more brilliant he was in the spotlight, the more fragile he became backstage. That fateful moment came faster than anyone could have imagined. At around 10:40 a.m., in the luxurious yet suffocatingly silent bedroom, Michael Jackson whispered in a voice hoarse from exhaustion, "I have to sleep. If I don't sleep, the tour will be canceled." That single sentence carried the weight of an entire verdict hanging over his head. Murray heard it. His hands trembled for a moment, and then he decided to cross the thinnest line in medicine. He injected a 25 mg dose of propofol into Michael's vein, mixed with lidocaine to reduce the burning sensation. It was not just an injection, but the starting point of a tragic storm that would haunt the world. Propofol is a powerful anesthetic designed to put people into a deep sleep in an operating room, where even the smallest changes in heart rate, breathing, or blood pressure are closely monitored by an array of modern machinery. But in that room, there was no heart monitor, no oxygen tube, no guarantee other than the hand of a doctor who was struggling to meet the plea of the most famous patient on the planet. The bitter irony was that Michael had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a private specialist, yet he did not receive the most basic things that any ordinary patient in a hospital would have. The effect of propofol appeared almost immediately. Just a few seconds later, Michael's eyelids grew heavy, his body relaxed, and his breathing gradually slowed. For a normal person, that would be a calm state. But for a body that had already accumulated lorazepam, midazolam, and other sedatives, that moment of calm was like sliding down a dangerous slope. People often say that propofol has a short duration, meaning one wakes up quickly when the infusion stops, but that's just a theory under ideal conditions. In Michael's situation, the combination of propofol and the substances already in his bloodstream turned into a chemical storm that no one could control. And then, the worst part came from overconfidence. Murray, instead of sitting by the bed monitoring every breath and heartbeat of his patient, left the room. Some testimonies claimed he went out to take a phone call. Other rumors said he was busy texting a woman. Whatever the reason, the brutal truth remains. Michael Jackson, in his most fragile state, was left alone. There were no eyes watching, no hands ready to intervene when his chest began to stop in small, faltering rhythms. The minutes that followed were a complete darkness that no one could fill with explanations. When Murray returned, he found Michael had sunk deeper than he had imagined. His breathing was shallow, his heart rate was erratic, and his body was getting cold. This moment in any medical document is a warning. Propofol must always be accompanied by monitoring machines and specialized personnel. But Michael didn't have that privilege. Even though he was the brightest star on the planet, the painful irony remained. A legend who could afford anything could not buy the minimum safety he needed most. What made everyone shudder was the delay. If he had been right by the bed, Murray could have detected the respiratory depression in seconds, provided assisted breathing, called for an ambulance, or at least stimulated the body to maintain a heartbeat. But precious minutes slipped by in his absence. When the emergency 911 call was finally made, and when the paramedics arrived, what they faced was no longer an emergency that could be saved, but a tragedy that had been determined from the very first minute. That moment at 10:40 a.m. became a deep cut into the collective memory. Fans thought Michael Jackson fell due to age, exhaustion, or some conspiracy. But the truth was simpler yet more brutal. A dose of propofol, a room lacking equipment, and a doctor who wasn't there when his patient needed him most. All of it combined to create a medical tragedy that the whole world has not stopped debating for over a decade. If the night before was a contradiction between fame and darkness, the morning of June 25th was the moment that contradiction exploded into tragedy. Michael, a man of color who had endured all kinds of prejudice, who had overcome countless barriers to become a global icon, finally succumbed to the most seemingly mundane thing, sleep. And when he whispered, "I have to sleep," no one knew that those words would become the final echo of an entire legend. The light of truth finally emerged, but it came not from confessions, but from a cold conclusion by the Los Angeles County coroner. The official report determined the cause of death: acute propofol intoxication, with other benzodiazepines in his blood contributing to the severity. A short but heavy phrase, more weighty than any sentence: homicide. The death was classified as a killing due to the unusual, incorrect, and dangerous use of medication. The world was stunned. From millions of fans across continents to the largest newspapers, everyone was shaken by this conclusion. Michael Jackson did not just pass away due to a medical accident. He died in a scenario where the responsibility fell heavily on the shoulders of the person who was supposed to be his health guardian, Dr. Conrad Murray. In 2011, 2 years after the fateful day, Dr. Conrad Murray stood trial for involuntary manslaughter. The Los Angeles courtroom became a global focal point where every testimony and every detail presented was analyzed down to the last breath. The prosecution painted a cold and haunting picture. Murray, a licensed doctor, chose to act outside all basic medical standards. He injected propofol, a powerful anesthetic that should only be used in a hospital, in Jackson's private bedroom with no cardiac monitors, no oxygen meters, and no resuscitation equipment. And worse, he left the room while the patient was in a dangerous state. It was not a small mistake. It was a series of irresponsible actions that led to an irreversible tragedy. The defense, however, still had people willing to protect him. The main argument they put forward was that Michael Jackson had lived for many years in a state of dependency on strong sleeping pills. They presented the theory that Jackson might have injected the propofol himself in the moments when Murray was absent, exceeding the allowed dosage. It was a contradictory defense, as it lacked concrete evidence. It was just a way to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's minds. The trial quickly became a media storm. Hundreds of journalists crowded outside. Jackson's fans cried silently, holding up signs that read, "Justice for Michael." Every day of the trial, live television broadcasts drew millions of people into an unprecedented legal tragedy. The witnesses took the stand one by one. Medical experts explained that propofol should never be used as a sleep aid at home. The lack of monitoring equipment was a blatant disregard for life. Investigators recreated the scene where vials, syringes, and evidence of prolonged usage were found. Jackson's family sat in the back silent, but their eyes were filled with fury and pain. Each testimony further deepened the collective wound because the truth, even when presented in the light of the courtroom, brought an unacceptable pain. Michael Jackson should not have died. The trial was not just a confrontation of evidence and arguments, it was also a battle of narratives. The prosecutor described Murray as a man who abandoned his patient at the most dangerous moment. Meanwhile, Murray's legal team tried to shift the responsibility onto Jackson's dangerous habits, claiming that his drug dependency made any intervention hopeless. But the obvious truth still stood out. Murray did not act as a responsible doctor. Leaving the room when a patient had just been injected with an extremely potent anesthetic was unjustifiable. And not calling 911 immediately when the situation worsened made the picture even murkier. Outside the court, public opinion was deeply divided. One side believed Murray was the main culprit, a man who disregarded a life in exchange for money and the glamour of being a star's personal doctor. The other side whispered that Jackson was already on a downward spiral of drug dependency, and that his death was the inevitable result of many years lived under pressure and in loneliness. Regardless of which side they were on, everyone had to confront the shocking truth. Michael Jackson's death was not a natural accident. When the prosecutor finished his argument, the jury was put in a difficult position. They had to choose between a defense lacking evidence and a series of clear medical malpractice. No one could deny Murray was not just a doctor. He was the only person in the room, the only one who knew exactly what happened in those final minutes. The courtroom lights became stifling. Every eye was on Conrad Murray, the man who sat silently with a closed-off expression, but his hands were clenched so tightly that veins were visible. He knew that with just one verdict, his entire life would be defined forever. 16 years after that fateful day that shook the world, Conrad Murray, the doctor who was convicted of manslaughter in connection with Michael Jackson's death, unexpectedly re-emerged with a bombshell claim. He said that what the public had known all those years was not the whole truth. His words were like a knife slicing open a wound that had never fully healed in the memories of fans, pulling everyone back to the dark tragedy of 2009. But this time, instead of bowing his head and admitting his medical mistakes, Murray reversed the story. He claimed that Michael Jackson had brought about his own death by secretly injecting an additional dose of propofol during the time Murray was not monitoring him. Murray began with the tone of a person who had suffered an injustice and wanted to clear his name. He argued that the 25 mg dose of propofol he injected into Jackson that morning was just an initial small and completely controllable dose. According to Murray, it could not have been a lethal amount for an adult and certainly not powerful enough to take down the king of pop, who was accustomed to years of using sedatives. He insisted that he was always nearby to monitor the patient's condition, but that Jackson, in a state of desperation from sleeplessness and fear that the London shows would collapse, had found a way to inject more propofol when Murray left the room. This claim, like a needle plunged into a painful memory, shifted the entire responsibility from the doctor's hands to the victims. This argument was not entirely new. In the years after he was convicted, Murray had hinted at the possibility of Jackson's self-injecting the drugs, but this time he went further. He asserted that this was the definitive cause of death. He painted a picture of a Michael Jackson obsessed with sleep, trembling from the pressure of performing, secretly hiding drug vials and syringes in the room, and then performing the injection himself when his doctor's back was turned. Murray even tried to reinforce this theory by pointing out gaps in the coroner's report. Specifically, he claimed that the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office did not release the propofol levels in Jackson's brain. If that data existed, Murray believed it would shed light on how the drug spread to the central nervous system and, according to him, could prove that the fatal dose was not from his initial injection. But immediately, forensic experts and the prosecutors who had participated in the original case reacted fiercely. They maintained that the data released in the report, the concentration of propofol in his blood, the signs of respiratory depression, and the combination with benzodiazepines was completely sufficient to reach a conclusion. They argued that Murray was trying to distract, grasping at non-existent or unnecessary details to create doubt. After all, even if Jackson had used more, the mere act of allowing an extremely powerful anesthetic to be present in an uncontrolled environment was a serious medical crime. Murray, in his new defense, did not just focus on propofol. He broadened his argument by mentioning the benzodiazepines, lorazepam, and midazolam that were already in Michael's system from previous nights. According to him, the combined effect of these sedatives was what pushed Jackson to the brink of death, gradually weakening his respiratory and cardiovascular functions. He argued that this was the hidden part that the world refused to accept, that Michael Jackson was not just dependent on a single injection, but on a complex system of medications that had accumulated in his bloodstream, many of which he, Dr. Murray, was not fully informed about. Despite this, the prosecutors and even the lawyers who had convicted him remained steadfast in their denial of this story's credibility. They argued that Murray was trying to shift the blame from himself after 16 years of living under the public's hateful gaze. In their eyes, the fact that Murray agreed to inject propofol, a drug that should only be used in an operating room with continuous monitoring, into a star's bedroom was an act that went beyond all medical standards. Whether Michael self-injected more or not, they claimed, could not erase the doctor's responsibility. These new claims immediately stirred up the fan community. On one side, those who had idolized Michael Jackson and considered Murray a murderer were now even more enraged that he dared to blame the victim himself. On the other side, a small group of skeptics began to ask questions. Was the justice served back, then too rushed? Was a part of the truth hidden, given that Michael Jackson was known for his dependency on sleeping pills for many years? The doubt itself, once sown, was enough to make the memory of his death more tangled and blurred than ever. Murray also didn't stop at just recounting old details. He posed challenging questions. Why didn't the coroner's report explain in more detail the process of how the drug moved through Michael's body? Why wasn't there an independent study analyzing the possibility of a patient self-injecting in that situation? And most importantly, why for the past 16 years has the public only heard one single story, a story that he claims was constructed to turn him into a scapegoat? These questions, though they may not have answers, still created a storm of intense debate. The public was pulled into a familiar vortex, doctor or victim, who was truly responsible. But beneath all those words, there was an undeniable truth. Michael Jackson died from a propofol dose so strong his body couldn't withstand it, and Murray was the only person tasked with preventing that from happening. No matter how much he tried to redefine his role, the shadow from Michael's death will forever hang over his name. And then, as the camera lens focused on Murray's face in the special interview, his eyes flickered with a look that was both helpless and defiant. He said, "People think I killed Michael, but Michael brought himself to that end. I was just the one left to bear all the guilt." That statement was like the final hammer blow, not to close the tragedy, but to open a new storm. A storm of doubt, of anger, and of a memory ripped apart after 16 years of being buried. Music. As soon as Conrad Murray announced his new truth, after 16 years, the world seemed to erupt once more. The Jackson family, the medical experts who had participated in the case, and a large portion of the public all reacted with furious indignation. People did not believe the scenario Murray constructed because it contradicted the forensic reports, witness testimonies, and independent evidence that had been authenticated during the investigation. It was like a tidal wave crashing down, burying the efforts of the doctor who had served time and turning him into a repeat offender in the eyes of the public, this time an offender against the truth. The Jackson family, who had already endured immense grief, would not accept any distortion of Michael's death. They asserted that Murray was deliberately trying to hide his responsibility by concocting the story of Michael's self-injecting propofol. In their eyes, this was not just an act of blaming the deceased, but also an insult to the memory of a musical icon. They cited the coroner's findings. Michael Jackson, at the age of 50, had a healthier heart than the average person his age, with no signs of severe atherosclerosis or congenital heart failure. This proved that he was not a person on the brink of death, as Murray implied. On the contrary, his body was still strong enough to live on if it had not been pushed into that tragic situation. But the autopsy results also showed another detail. Jackson's lungs were not perfect. He had signs of chronic inflammation and airway damage, which partially reduced his respiratory function. However, forensic doctors clearly concluded that these injuries were not the direct cause of death. The death, as they stated in the report, was the result of acute propofol intoxication with the contribution of benzodiazepines. That conclusion was strong enough to sweep aside any attempts to shift responsibility onto pre-existing medical conditions. While Murray sowed the idea that Michael had self-injected more propofol, experts were quick to point out the absurdity. Could a patient who was already under the influence of benzodiazepines, in a dazed and exhausted state, with an intense desire to sleep, have the technical skill to find a vein and intravenously inject a potent drug? This, according to the experts, was almost impossible. There was no legal evidence to prove that Michael could have performed such a precise act in that situation. It was merely a one-sided statement from Murray, completely lacking the backing of scientific evidence. Even the public, who had been somewhat divided after Michael's personal controversies, asked a bitter question. If Murray truly believed in the possibility of a self-injection, why didn't he present concrete evidence during the 2011 trial? Why wait 16 years to speak out? The words now, in the eyes of many, seemed like a desperate attempt to clear his name after years of being hated by the world. A series of other questions continued to hover in the public sphere like ghosts that were never set free. Why did Murray leave the bedroom while his patient was in a dangerous state after being injected with a powerful anesthetic? Why was there no basic monitoring equipment, no oxygen meter, no heart rate monitor, no respiratory alarm in a case involving propofol, a drug that every hospital requires strict supervision for? Why was the 911 emergency call made so late, after Michael had been motionless for too long, losing the golden opportunity for resuscitation? And why and how were vials of propofol, benzodiazepines, and lidocaine brought into a private artist's room instead of being locked securely in a medical control system? Each question was a knife cutting into Murray's credibility. He could release a new version of the story, but he couldn't erase the truth that he was responsible for Michael's life on that fateful morning. He was the one who turned a bedroom into a makeshift medical laboratory where just a small mistake became a global tragedy. And he was the one who delayed and hesitated in the moments between life and death, something that both the Jackson family and the public would never forgive. The Jackson family, after hearing the new confession, immediately issued an official statement. They said that Murray had not only committed a medical mistake, but was now committing an ethical one by trying to make Michael an accomplice in his own death. They emphasized that Michael was a victim of carelessness, a victim of an overly lenient private medical system, a victim of the very doctor he had placed his full trust in. That counter-statement was like a new indictment, making it clear that, in the family's eyes, Murray would forever be the one to blame. The public sided with the family, with the majority of people fiercely condemning Murray. Newspaper headlines emphasized his brazenness, duplicity, and inhumanity for blaming the deceased. On forums, fans left thousands of messages recalling the image of Michael clutching his chest, collapsing on the floor, and the choked voices of his children at the funeral. For them, no new truth could change the core fact. Murray held the syringe, injected the propofol, and left when Michael needed him most. Yet, despite being buried in criticism, Murray's words planted a seed of doubt in a small corner. Because if everything was so clear, why are there still so many unanswered questions? Why was the drug management process in Michael's home so lax? Who supplied the drugs? Who controlled the quantity? Who allowed them to be stored at home? And why, after all this time, is there still no thorough answer to every single detail? These gaps mean the story has never fully closed, and every time Murray opens his mouth, the wound is gouged deeper once more. In the darkness, amid the media storms, the image of Michael Jackson appears as a ghost trapped between truth and lies. He is no longer here to defend himself, to speak his part of the story. And that is what makes every debate more painful. On one side is the word of a convicted man. On the other is the sacred memory of a family and millions of fans. What remains, after all, is a series of questions hanging in the air, ambiguous details that have not been explained, and a pain that will never subside. The 2011 trial was a global stage where the light of justice shone directly on Dr. Conrad Murray. The prosecutors were firm that despite all convoluted arguments, the truth could not change. Murray had brought a drug meant only for hospitals into Michael Jackson's bedroom, injected it in conditions lacking proper equipment and personnel, and then abandoned him when the patient fell into a critical state. The final verdict rang out cold: involuntary manslaughter. A 4-year prison sentence was declared, but due to California's good time credit policy, Murray served nearly 2 years behind bars. When he walked out of jail, he was no longer a doctor. His license was revoked, his reputation was ruined, and his name was forever linked to the tragedy of the King of Pop. But the story didn't stop there. Nearly 16 years later, Murray's statements in interviews pushed the public into a new vortex of debate. He claimed that he was not the only one responsible, that Michael had found a way to use more of the drug himself when he was not in the room. Many saw this as a belated truth, an aspect that the court had never acknowledged. But just as many people believed that it was all just a desperate attempt to rewrite history and paint a different picture for himself. It is worth noting that despite these later accounts, the forensic and legal systems have maintained their position. Michael Jackson passed away from acute propofol intoxication, with benzodiazepines contributing, and that death was linked to the drug being used in the wrong environment, with the wrong procedure, and with the wrong level of supervision. This was not the result of an unavoidable surprise, but a chain of accumulated errors, a verdict that not only targeted one individual, but was also a stark warning about the deadly gap between the desire for sleep and medical standards. What pains the public is not just the passing of a legend, but the fact that his memory is constantly being dragged back into the courtroom, churned up by conflicting statements. Fans want to remember Michael as a symbol of music, of timeless dance moves, not as a patient in a dark bedroom with cold white drug vials. But Murray, with his statements, has made the wound that seemed to have closed bleed once more. After all, the remaining legacy is not just pain. It is also a serious lesson etched into the history of medicine and popular culture. That powerful drugs are never an easy solution for the pressures of life. That a doctor's responsibility lies not only in their expertise, but also in their sobriety and steadfastness in the face of a patient's dangerous wishes, and that gaps in supervision and management can turn a luxurious room into a haunting place. Michael Jackson is gone, but his story and Conrad Murray's will forever be a costly reminder of the price of carelessness, compromise, and silence in the moment of greatest need. 16 years have passed.